Hey, I'm George Abernathy, as you probably sadly know, but if you don't, I'm with FreightWaves, and I get to have the opportunity over the next half hour or so to talk with and have one of our WavesSide chats with Andy Clarke. Andy formerly served as the president and CEO of Panther Expedited, and was also CFO over at Forward Air. And most recently was CFO up at C.H. Robinson. So we're thrilled to have you here, Andy. Thank you for doing this. And we're gonna cover a lot of stuff here and try to keep this as interesting as I know it's going to be. And you'll probably have to throw something at me like we did with Matt to get me off, because having the opportunity to talk to somebody like Andy is what I live for. Listening to what the guys in the freight futures talked about. Volatility obviously was significant in 2018, right, but flip side 2019. So I want to give a little bit of the Andy Clarke macro, what's going on out there.
What a difference a year made.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, George, for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. Clearly routing guides are balanced right now, so anywhere from 1 to 1.2 to 1.4 versus this time last year, clearly north of 2. So volatility has subsided. And I like to tell people that it's important to remember to watch the movie and not just look at the still frame picture. Because over the last decade, there's been periods of sustained stability where routing guides were in balance and actually working. And then there were periods over a shorter period of time, a couple of quarters, usually led by a supply chain disruption. I think one of the panelists talked about a hurricane. And obviously, as we all know, in transportation, everybody's waiting for a hurricane to make their quarter. And so there's opportunities in those environments and in those marketplaces where supply chains do become dislocated and routing guides are not performing. GDP continues to be strong. A lot of capacity is coming to the marketplace. And as a result, you see a lot of stability there. So that's just in the United States. And globally, you're essentially seeing the same thing as well.
Same thing globally?
Correct.
Okay. So 2018 was described as a once in 100 years. It strikes me, probably won't be here 100 years from now, but it strikes me that I may see another of those once in 100 years. You talked about weather. Anything else that you would describe as what could cause that once in 100 years to happen again?
Well, let's go back to August of 17 when it started, right? And the hurricanes hit first Texas and then Florida. And then in December of that year, you also had ELDs. So you had a regulation that came into the marketplace, and a lot of people that have been around a long time were saying, hey, it's not going to take capacity out of the marketplace, but it's going to make what capacity remains less productive. And that's, in fact, what happened. And then you add to that the Tax Reform Act. And so there was a lot of capital that was coming into the marketplace. And as a result, you had good GDP. So a combination of weather, obviously regulations, and then positive GDP led to one of those events. I don't know. Do you see another weather event happening in the same form? Do you see another regulation happening in the same form and fashion where it does curtail the productivity? And then you'd have to see a lot of capacity coming out of the marketplace. So last year, Class 8s were well over 500,000, which is 2x of what it normally is. And so you now have capacity in the marketplace, and as we all know, it takes a long time for that to bleed out.
Gotcha. So as you think and look back into the time frame, I've known each other for a while. I was at Transplace for a long time. I was there after Transplace.com. What was it? Do you liken any of the things that may have been happening back in the the .com era to what we're seeing today?
I do. So let's go back to 1999 and 98 when the interwebs were invented and becoming a reality, and all the load boards were going to put the brokers out of business. And they were going to connect the shippers and the carriers directly. Here we are 20 years later, and while certain things have changed, the one thing that I would say that they simply dropped the .com. Nobody refers to it because, of course, that's natural. There's a lot of money in this marketplace. The same thing happened in 99. There's a lot of freight, which is the same thing that was happening in 99 and 2000. And there's a lot of technology, and I'll tip my hat to the people that are actually developing and utilizing technology. But my joke is, what do the bunny rabbit and digital brokers have in common? Neither of them actually exist. It's a joke. It's a bad one at that. But the point is, You're either a broker or you're not. You're
Right.
either a shipper or you're not. And by the way, there's a lot of great brokers out there that use technology. But I think to a degree, it's all about your perspective and the perspective of what type of logistics provider are you. So let's talk about the supply chain. The supply chain has what I'll call like 6 factors to it, right? Planning, sourcing, demand and inventory, production, transportation and warehouse, and then returns. And I think a lot of people have spent an inordinate amount of time talking about the 5th one, which is transportation and warehousing. And yet, in order to be a very successful 3PL, you really need to understand that visibility and the connectivity into whoever your customer is, what their ultimate supply chain are, and who their partners are. Because simply saying, hey, I've got a truck and I can show you on a map where it is, that's interesting in and of itself. But it's not interesting if you can't tell your customer what is on that truck and what they need to prepare for when it arrives at the actual destination. These are just small variables. And so the perspective is, are you just going to be a broker? Which again, that's a wonderful, it's a wonderful business, absolutely wonderful business. And there's a lot of people that do it. There's 14,000 registered brokers in North America right now, and I would expect there to be more in 2019 and more in 2020, because it's a great market to be in. Obviously, Robinson, Hub, all these, Hunt, very successful companies have proven that it's a very great business to be in. But if you're one of those large organizations, you're expanding your platform as well, and you're trying to help your customers manage all 6 of those functions and not just the transportation and warehouse.
So as you think about trying to expand, and you and the team at Robinson delivered some hellaciously good results, how much of a balancing act was it for you to be considerate around organic versus acquisition? And you've been through sort of both sides of that equation, and not only as you thought about it at Robinson, but in your new role at sort of scanning the market as to what's out there. We know about valuations. What do you think is going to happen in the
Well,
really? I mean, everybody always asks that question, but really interested. What is going to happen in the M&A area?
Well, I mean, again, you go back to the well-established players versus some of the startups that are operating, in some cases, under a different valuation metric.
Right.
And that's fine. And, if you look at the whole ecosystem that's out there, you've got the shippers, you've got the carriers, you've got the brokers, you've got technology, and you have investors.
Yep.
And certain investors value certain companies in a certain way. And if I knew the answer to how they did that, I certainly would have their job and have their money. As a result, I don't. And I don't think established companies, quite frankly, while they may be on the margin slightly perturbed by it, we've seen this movie before.
Right.
Which is why I go back to 1999. There were a lot of brokers, there were a lot of load boards, there were a lot of companies that started. One of which was FreightQuote. In fact, it was called FreightQuote.com. And their entire premise was that at some point in the future, we're going to develop this great technology. It's going to make it easier and effective for us to connect to our customers and our carriers. And at some point, we're just going to turn off all the lights, and the machines are going to take care of all the transactions.
Yep.
They developed a lot of really interesting and powerful technology to connect to the shipper and to connect to the carrier. But when C.H. Robinson bought them in January of 2015, there were 1,000 people in Kansas City.
Right.
Very successful people in Kansas City. Today, there's still 1,000 people in Kansas City still doing a wonderful job of helping customers and helping carriers transact. They're more effective and more efficient today than they have been in the past, but there's still people involved.
Right. That's really interesting. So we go back to the 1999, and let's go back even the Wayback Machine even further. So it's a 25-year ago, Andy Clarke, and you have now hindsight being 2020. What would have surprised the 25-year ago Andy Clarke that has occurred within the space? I'm probably going to follow it up with what do you think's going to happen? But what would have surprised him? Because brokers are brokers still. What is different?
All those companies that were around for the most part 25 years ago are still around today in one form or fashion. And so you have the different themes of consolidation, right? And it happens at different points in the economic cycle. It doesn't happen at the most powerful points in the economic cycle. It usually is after you've bounced off the bottom and companies start to see the recovery, and so you start to see consolidation. You see it in the asset-based space, you see it in the non-asset-based space, and you're seeing it to a degree in the technology space. And so, but I guess if I were sitting back there when I was in the way back, when I was an investment banker, and we were pitching all these mergers of saying 1 + 1 = something slightly greater than 2, you should do this, pay me a fee, thank you very much, I'm going to the next person. And it's a little bit different than what you see in a spreadsheet. And ultimately, when people are involved and technology is involved and processes are involved, it doesn't actually work out the way it's supposed to work in an Excel spreadsheet because of all those elements. And so there have been deals that have gotten done that have been wonderfully and wildly successful, and there have been deals that have gotten done that have been horrible. I would have assumed 25 years ago that when you plugged it all into a spreadsheet, it would have just happened in a much more, there would be 4 large providers out there, and there would be, but today there are more than there ever have been. And we all know there are people in this room that are alumni of C.H. Robinson. There are people in this room that are alumni of other brokerage organizations because they have a viewpoint that's different than everybody else. And by the way, I see that continuing to occur. Freight still gets picked up at origin and dropped off at destination. That has not changed. The manner in which it does it really hasn't changed. So you got the rails, the intermodal, you got trucks, you got ocean, you got air. I mean, it's all pretty much the same thing. We're not flying around in jetpacks yet. Drones are coming at some point, but they're not here. And you know, I was having this conversation a couple of different points over the last month around autonomous. And people ask, and I said, well, if you think about the value of all the assets, all the rolling assets, trucks and cars today, it's roughly, and I've done the math, but it's directionally correct, it's about $9 trillion. And so let's just assume for a moment that autonomy, the technology, the infrastructure, everything that is there is ready to go today. Let's just assume that. It's not. I think we're well into the future of that actually being a reality. But even if it were, what are you doing with the $9 trillion of assets? They're not bleeding off tomorrow. And every time, by the way, this is one of the few times I've had the opportunity to speak in front of people where whatever I said wasn't going to get filed with the SEC, so this is really good. Is, you know, the issue is when people would ask me, well, what did, you know, Tesla and AV and all this, I said, well, just show me where the production facility is. Please just point me in the direction of the production facility, tell me when they're going to start making them, and what it's going to look like. And if you can answer that for me, I can tell you how us or anybody else would react in that environment. Even if you were able to manufacture 1,000 units per day, which you're not in terms of the retrofitting, how are you going to induct that into the marketplace? You know, again, it goes back to what I thought 25 years ago. It's just like everything should go together and it should work out because intellectually it makes sense. There's a lot more to actually making it reality.
So you said $9 trillion. It's a hell of a write-down if somebody's going to have to take a $9 trillion write-down. So it's probably not going to happen. So it's the opposite of the Wayback Machine. We're going to get the crystal ball out now, and you know, Andy's going to be sage. Andy, tell us. You know, you've talked about autonomous, but one thing, 5 years, 10 years from now, with the digitization, whether the Easter Bunny or digital brokers are more likely to be in existence.
My money's on the Easter Bunny.
Okay. Is there going to be more intermediaries 5 years from now? Will somehow scale, you know, start to take hold? Obviously, you know, Robinson will probably be X percentage bigger. What do you see as far as the future of new brokerages, technologies, and the like?
Well, I'll just start by saying Sage and Andy have never been used in the same sentence or paragraph. So
I'm trying to get FreightWaves to put a nice quote out there.
I appreciate that. I appreciate that. That one's not going to make it. So the direct answer is, do I believe there are going to be more intermediaries? Yes. And a lot of it is predicated on, again, not the technology and not the people in this room. It's based on the complexities of the supply chains of the customers. And if you kind of add one more element to that, the issue is the silos with which they operate. There's somebody at General Motors that's responsible for production of this facility, and somebody's responsible for labor, and somebody's responsible for procurement, and none of them talk to each other. And their systems are pretty complex. And so they're relying on others to provide that information and service to them. The value of a GM vehicles, 65% of it comes from a supplier. And so if you just think about that complexity with one customer and then multiply that by the millions that are out there, I think the need for intermediaries is going to continue to exist. And then I go back to, again, the perspective of what I'll call the established players and the new entrants. And both of them serve a purpose, because the established players, to a degree, are like aircraft carrier groups, right? And you can solve a lot of problems that are complex and global for your 100,000 plus customers with an aircraft carrier group.
Yep.
What you can't do is go upriver in a gunboat and be nimble in that regard, or you can, but to a limited degree. And so the perspective of the established players doing what they're doing and the new entrants, however they categorize themselves, they're simply playing a different game. And I think a lot of times the message gets a bit muddled when people are talking about there's room for a lot of people.
Right.
If you think about when Robinson and others went public in the late 90s, a whole concept of what a broker was, first of all, nobody knew what it was.
Right.
And when they found out, they just assumed it was bad. Today, and that was 4% of the 3PL marketplace, today it's 20. I think the thesis that is going to 25 is a lot more valid than it going to 15. I would completely take the over on 20% at any point in the future. If you want to set up a futures market for that, then I'll start putting my money into that.
That sounds good. Well, we talked a little bit about 18. I'm interested because you were in the throes of it at Robinson at that point, where routing guides were falling apart early in the year. Things were challenged. Did you see the behavior of shippers start to change, and has that continued into 2019? Have they fallen back into their old habits, and is there any such thing as a shipper of choice?
There are such things as shipper of choice. So if you think about 1 million plus shippers that are out there, you can't throw them all into to a category of saying they all act one way or the other. And you see what I would say, at different periods of time, it's directional monogamy when it comes to routing guides, and maybe that quote will show up. Or directional promiscuity when it goes in the other direction. And they're balancing their supply chains just like you would expect, because somebody in that supply chain group is reporting up to a CFO, who's reporting to a CEO, who's then has to go on an earnings call in the first quarter of 2018. There's an equity conference in Miami after everybody reports their numbers, and last year was a wonderful time to be down in Miami. The weather was great, and everybody's results were hitting record levels. And you heard industrial CEOs talking for the very first time about their supply chains and transportation that they had never even, because they're missing their numbers because they weren't able to balance that because routing guides deteriorated. Well, today they're going in the opposite direction, and everybody is still kind of remembering the snowmageddon of 14 and 15. And so I would say that if they're being, if they're maintaining their routing guide, they're probably doing it on a shorter duration. It's no longer a 12-month. It's probably a 9-month. It's probably a 6-month, and they'll probably start bringing it in as spot rates have inverted and gone down below contractual. I would assume if you're a rational shipper, you're going to hit your primary bid, and as soon as that valve turns off, they'll go right into the spot market.
How would you, knowing that's what was going to occur, how would C.H. Robinson prepare or be prepared for that? Was there certain data you were looking at that would foretell that, or how would you predict, and how would you then try to turn that aircraft carrier to deal with it?
It is taking reams and reams of data that's out there and turning it into actionable information. And Robinson has made a stake, which I agree, of having their account reps out in the field. And it's a very, it's a way to stay close to the shippers to understand where they are. I mean, again, you can analyze a bunch of data and reach the wrong conclusion if you're not pulling in all the disparate factors that are out there, which is a lot of that comes from the account management discipline, which, when all these new entrants came into the marketplace, everybody particularly on the investor side, would often talk about technology, and then you would go to their actual, the job
Right.
sites and all that, and who are they hiring? They're hiring account managers and carrier managers. Kind of,
Right.
that's what brokers do.
Yep.
Because you get valuable information from having conversations with accounts, and you get valuable information from having conversations with carriers to understand what's happening real time in the marketplace.
One of the topics of great interest is e-commerce, obviously, and the impact. It's sort of a two-part thing here. E-commerce increasing the amount of freight that's moving in that last mile. We heard earlier about the expectations that I have that I can order it now and it'll be delivered now. So I've got different freight there. And I guess I'll go straight to the e-commerce question. In the world of brokers, FreightWaves has reported that there's a
You guys wrote an article on that?
really large broker up in the Pacific Northwest that may have an e-commerce effect. How is the brokerage market thinking about the entrance of an Amazon into an intermediary type role?
Well, I would let, to address that specifically, I would let all of them come up on stage and tell you how they're viewing Amazon. I view e-commerce writ large as a good thing for intermediaries because remember, again, with the way back, you had a distribution center somewhere in the Inland Empire and a distribution center somewhere in Harrisburg. And you didn't have the velocity that you had, and your length of haul was pretty long. Well, today the length of hauls have come in rather dramatically, but your velocity has increased as well. And as a result, that allows a lot of intermediaries to play in a much more broader field. I think, again, the misconception is that everybody else is just like, well, gosh, if the company in Seattle is doing it, we should just pretty much, close up shop and burn the furniture for fuel. Nobody's doing that. Everybody's reacting. And by the way, the shippers are reacting as well. All the retailers, all the other providers, the customers that are out there are reacting as well. And I would say that every established player, every startup that's out there is probably having customer meetings right now that are dealing with a first and second derivative answer to what Amazon are doing.
Okay.
I would also say that, again, established versus new entrants, there simply is a difference in the expectations of the investor base. I couldn't even begin to tell you what the investor expectation is for the company that's based in Seattle.
Right.
And to a degree, I couldn't tell you what the investor expectation is for some of these startups that are receiving, as we've read about very, very openly about the valuations that they're getting. All I know is that some of these established players have done a wonderful job of growing their business and returning significant amount of capital to their shareholders. And so that's valued in a certain way versus something else. But again, we saw this in 1999.
Right.
And we saw this in 2006 and 2007 before the Great Recession, which is why I go back and point everybody to the movie. You have to watch the movie and not just look at the still frames as they come in because you'll lose the perspective.
Let's think about the movie and go past Amazon. Are there other shippers? You've interacted with shippers for a long time. Do you see other shippers potentially thinking they've got the scale, mojo, technology, network, supply chain to try to also move into becoming a transportation provider, a brokerage themselves?
Again, I don't think that while they might have had that conversation,
or even a load board,
it's something that you're known for what you're known for.
Right.
And to then try to communicate broadly to not only the world, i.e. your customers, your investors, to change the expectation of what you are versus, again, a retailer in that case, or an industrial. I mean, you've seen customers at times at different points try to kind of get together with a shipping consortium. Right? I mean, it was the same thing as we talked about backstage with with the introduction of Transplace.com was the truckers. They got together to try to figure out how to more effectively backhaul their trucks. And again, that was something that today Transplace, as successful as it is, isn't that model anymore.
Right, exactly, yeah. All right, so in our last couple of minutes, looking forward, sort of coming into data, if you were driving the business, you were driving the intermediary, what data would you ask of the community of folks out there if they could make it available to you? This is ubiquitous now. What data would you like to get from them to be able to put your data science to it and then be able to come up with an analytic or a metric that you'd be able to drive the business on?
Well, again, it depends on if you're on the shipper side or on the carrier side. Okay. And clearly, there's a lot of work that's being done on the carrier side to understand what is the utilization and capacity of that truck and what can they do. We've all taken the ride-sharing apps, and in the ride-sharing apps, you either go with your own or you do the pool concept, and I think that's a very fascinating, it's a much shorter duration, much shorter length of haul. But if I were on the controlling all the data of the trucks, I would want to know exactly what was it, how much capacity was still left in that truck. And conversely, I would look at all the shippers and I would say, okay, what is your production schedule and what is the actual time sensitivity? This is where there's just a complete lack of coordination on the supplier side, because the supplier has a ship by date and the customer has an arrive by date, and those two are not in sync. And trying to get them in sync and trying to get that information so that you're able to better manage your supply chain. So again, just think about like what is the objective of the ultimate shipper, right? The ultimate shipper, transportation is a small portion of that. What's a larger portion is their labor.
Right.
What's a larger portion is their geographic footprint. What's a larger portion is all like their inventory carrying costs. I mean, these are all pretty significant costs that are embedded in their supply chain that they would just say to everybody in this room, if you're a digital, if you're a broker, or if you're a asset-based provider, like, oh, we just want to go from 4% to 3%. And you're only going to do that by lowering your cost. And I'm like, well, that seems like pretty unfulfilling if you're running an intermediary.
Yeah. Last question, we're down to our last minute or two, sadly. As Andy looks, Sage Andy, looks to what's next, what excites you about what's next? What are you looking to? I mean, you've had the distinguished career now. You got plenty of runway in front of you. What excites you about what you might be able to do next?
Well, there's a tremendous amount of opportunity in this marketplace. I mean, you just think about global GDP and the percent of that goes to logistics. And solving problems is really, it's at the heart of what we do. And you have opportunities to do it on a big scale. You have opportunities to do it on a small scale. And I would say that my advice to people have been, if you're thinking about what's next, one of the things that I think is going to really take more of a hold is the drive for efficiency. And so if you're an account rep and I'm a carrier rep, what are we doing? We're sitting there and you're talking to the customers and I'm talking to the carriers, and we want to have everything that we do be the most productive.
Yeah.
And everything else you shouldn't do, right? You've got the opportunity for the business process outsourcing, whether it's starting with simply as check calls and then layering in productivity enhancements so that those people that have the customer relationships, those people that have the carrier relationships, can spend all their time solving their problems. Because I don't think, quite frankly, I mean, the market size is expanding. Go back, it's going to be north of 20%. And if you think about the labor pool that's out there, I mean, as we all know, it's more and more difficult to hire the younger generation into doing things that we grew up doing. And the more that you can pull that out from them, first of all, it's not what they would consider to be life fulfilling.
Right.
So they're not going to do it. Your turnover is going to be high. Why don't you pull that all out? Give them jobs that they want to do. Help them see how they can grow a career by being productive, and take everything else and lean it out. Because we're at a period right now where as costs go down, margins tend to expand. And you've seen brokers, however they categorize themselves in an expanding margin environment, at some point, again, just go back to the movie, margins compress.
Right.
And the better able you're to be the most efficient provider, whether you're using people that aren't based in the United States or whether you're using technology, the more likely and the better able you're to position yourself with the customers and with the carriers.
Wonderful. Well, we're at the end. Andrew Clarke, everyone, thank you very much, Andy. Appreciate it. Thank you, sir. Perfect. Well done.